All right, part 3 on lecture 12, aspects of emotion. So now let's talk about some cognitive aspects of emotion, right? And the appraisal process. So I promised we'd define that word, and we probably need to get around to that. Appraisal is the ability to cognitively interpret an emotional state. So what we're arguing here is that part of the emotional experience is what we think about the emotional experience, what we think about the stimulus that prompted the emotional experience, and what we might think about the results of that emotional experience. That's you, sweetie. I think Proton might just blow her nose off any minute here. Got a bit of a cold, no doubt, right? So, the appraisal is the estimate of the personal significance of an event, is one way to look at it. This is hugely important in stress research. To what extent do I appraise the stressor as threatening, and to what extent do I understand my resources for dealing with it? So, without antecedent cognitive appraisal of the event, emotions do not occur. Now, we're going to talk about a group of researchers who said emotion follows thinking. Thinking comes first. They were also called cognitive primacy, that is putting thinking, cognition ahead of emotional responding. And they then from there go on to say that it's the appraisal, not the event itself, right, which causes the emotion. So I have to think my way to an emotional state. And this ran into some problems, and there's a lot of people who kind of disagree with this theory. So the appraisal theory of emotion, right, it relies on 3 questions, and this is like a built-in mechanism to the human mind. And the first question is, how does the perception of an object or event produce a good or bad appraisal? How does the appraisal generate the emotion, and how does felt emotion express itself in action? So what you see is then you encounter situations, some kind of stimulus, right? Some kind of life event, if you will. And then is it good or bad? Is it beneficial or harmful? Is kind of the core question that's asked. What is the valence of that event? And then emotions. It would then imply that a good event, the one that is appraised as being good or beneficial to the organism, generates liking. And the converse is, if it's a negative event, then it should promote disliking. And then the action then is the approach or withdrawal, the idea approaching pleasant stimuli and avoiding what are believed to be unpleasant or harmful stimuli. So this comes to us largely from Lazarus, and he's going to pin specific emotions to specific appraisals to events. And these are complex appraisals, so the cognitive process that intervene between important life events and the physiological and behavioral reactivity. So you can see in this yellowish box here the appraisal. Type of benefit, type of harm, or type of threat, if you will. So let's go with the top line for the example. We won't go through each example, but making progress towards a goal could generate happiness, right? Or being moved by another's suffering. If we go down here, then the likely result is compassion. So he's basically saying, here's the type of life event. We process it cognitively, we evaluate it, if you will, and that evaluation then yields the emotion. Okay? For harm, let's use some examples there. Being demeaned by a personal offense then might lead to anger, right? Experiencing an irrevocable loss, right? Down here then would be sadness. Problem is that you might find individual differences in these, and it becomes problematic at some point in time, if you will. Now, type of threat, facing an uncertain, unspecified threat would be anxiety. Notice that anxiety is a threat that's not well defined and probably temporally hard to pin down, whereas you see fear or fright in this case is facing an immediate overwhelming danger that is usually clearly evaluated, clearly understood. So you can go down the list and kind of work your way thinking through each one. let us then take a look at the appraisal model of emotion then. We have a stimulus event, right? And the primary appraisal, we're going to ask the questions. Is this personally relevant, right? Does it matter to me? Because if it's not personally relevant, I don't need to concern myself. One of the default questions, right, survivability is it harmful? And that's one of the questions, the appraisal processes that probably comes right up front. So is it relevant? Okay, yeah, it's relevant. Well, is it harmful? God, do I have to do something about it? Right? Or is it potentially useful? And that then, if no ENS arousal, no coping required, right? If it's not relevant and no emotional reaction. But now, if we look at the situational context, we start moving down this way. If the autonomic nervous system is activated, approach avoidance based on the primary appraisal. So is it harmful? Then that's probably going to signal the need to avoid. If it's not harmful, not assessed as harmful, but maybe possibly useful, then the approach behavior is probably instigated. Right? And this is based on the primary appraisal. Now the secondary appraisal is the coping resources. So that which is harmful, potentially harmful, but I have the ability to cope, right? Successful coping, then my autonomic nervous system will likely decrease. Like, oh my God, there's a snake, but wow, that snake is way far away, and I got my snake stick, so I'm good. I don't worry about it. You know, I might feel a little antsy, but I'm not freaking out. Right? And the emotional reaction then subsides. But if the coping resource is limited, unsuccessful coping, then notice the autonomic nervous system remains activated and we begin to experience stress, anxiety, or maybe a fight or flight response. Notice this relies then typically on the thinking. And it doesn't necessarily allow for automatic responding, which becomes problematic for those of us who want to also embrace non-conscious emotions, high road versus low road emotions. Then you have to kind of make this this appraisal process non-conscious, and it becomes a more complex model. Does emotion occur this way? Many of us have said yes, sometimes it occurs this way, but you can't use this as a general explanation for all emotional experiences, kind of where we get at. So, Proton has rejoined us. Are you done sneezing now, sweetie? Are you feeling better? Yeah. Good girl. All right. Now, we're going to, and you'll have to differentiate these carefully, right? Because this next model is somewhat similar because it uses appraisal processes, both primary and secondary, but it is an attributional model rather than the straight-up cognition model. So in this case, what do we have? Well, we look at the outcome, right? And that's where we're going to start here. The primary appraisal, if the outcome is negative, then it kind of leads generally to sadness. If the outcome is positive, simply leads to happiness, right? Now, to get to 7 essentially basic emotions that are considered in this model, the secondary appraisal then looks at what was the cause. Right? So remember, when we talk attributions, attribution is what caused this in the simplest kind of language. So, wow, let's go up the top route. Boy, that was a nice outcome. That's something I appreciate. Happiness is the first kind of step. Were you responsible for this thing that happened that made you happy? Then you get to experience pride, right? Okay. Now, if someone else made it possible for you to experience this happiness, right, then you're going to probably generate an external cause. Hope is the result of a stable cause. Okay. Now let's go down to the negative aspects. If the outcome is negative, if it was externable and someone did it on purpose, so notice, boy, someone did it, that's external, and they could have not done it, that is controllable, but they decided to do it, then I'm going to get pissed off, anger, right? Now, if it's external but uncontrollable, pity could be the response. Okay. Now, if it's internally generated, that is my fault, and it was controllable, now I'm going to feel guilty, I should have never done that, right? And if it's internal but uncontrollable, then I might experience shame in being observed and having done it. I would imagine if you reflect on this model, you can find perhaps a lot of potential to argue against it. A lot of alternative explanations and a lot of examples that might not fit. And with both these cognitive models, whether it's a straight up appraisal model or it is the attributional theory model, I think they apply in certain instances. So let's get to that in a minute. So the major camps of emotion researchers, and this is like their little camps, and especially in the 1980s, these people really did war with each other in the journals and at conferences, etc., and the research they designed. It was kind of funny to watch this level. The psychological theories of emotion then, and they get these names. James Lang, an emotion-provoking stimulus produces physical response that in turn produces an emotion. So what happens? Physical responding, which is largely instinctual. I see a bear, I run, and then I realize I'm afraid, right? The Cannon-Bard theory says no, an emotional feeling and internal physiological response occur at the same time, right? So, oh my God, bear and running equals fear. Because bears are frightening, bears can do me harm, right? That's part of the appraisal of harm. And I'm running, I'm becoming activated, I can feel my heart going up. When those two things occur, harm and activation, I must be afraid. So it takes two pieces to get there. One is not the cause of other, the appraisal and both the result of a cognitive appraisal of the situation. Right? And now finally the two-factor theory that came to us from Schachter and Singer. Right? Emotion results from the appraisal of both the physiological arousal and the stimulus itself. So here's a handy-dandy cheat sheet. And this is historic stuff. You probably first saw this in Psych 1100, so we're just revisiting it briefly. I see a snake, according to James Lang, causes physiological arousal, trembling heart rate, and I need to explain that, and I say, I must be afraid. Right? Now the Cannon-Bard theory says there's a snake, and I feel the arousal, and I feel the emotion simultaneously. They don't have anything to do with each other. And then finally, the two-factor theory. Boy, I'm aroused, I feel afraid, and I'm going to call that fear. So I end up there. The basic idea is which is right, and it just depends on the situation. And remember, like I said, one of my favorite words is depends. So if you can answer depends to a question, you say, hey, well, you know, what about this? And you say, oh, it depends. You're not wrong at that point. Now the danger in using the answer depends is what comes next. I'm going to ask you the question depends on what. So depends only gets us so far, and then we have to explain. What, Proton? Come here. Do you want to come here? No? Okay. You just want to meow at us. All right. So two models then, really, and this is kind of how it broke out in the literature when Lazarus and Zients were arguing about this in the 1980s. You got the appraisal theory, stimuli leads to thinking about the stimuli and all those questions we've described, and then we determine the emotional experience from that. The affective primacy, that is emotion first, that is the stimulus is encountered, it causes me to have an emotional reaction, and I have to think to explain it. If I ask you which is correct, the simple answer here, which is correct? Both. And notice you can daisy chain these. So the stimuli leads to cognitions, leads to emotional experience, which might lead to more thinking about is this an appropriate emotion, which then might lead to a new emotion based on what we thought at that point in time. For example, have you ever wondered if you should be angry because someone said something? And you go, what did they say to me? I don't know what I think about that. I've got to think about this. I don't know if I should be pissed off. Right, so we can see this is a more complex process, and I think both camps back then tried to oversimplify, overgeneralize, and lost some of the nuances, the complexity in the way we process our world as humans. Right? So, social and cultural aspects, if we want to add another layer onto it, if this hasn't been enough, right? What do we know? Well, in fact, the socio-cultural context one lives in contributes to your understanding of the emotion and whether it's appropriate or not. So different emotions are appropriate in different situations. Also note that different emotions are appropriate largely. One of the best examples is gender-based. How many of you guys were taught, big boys don't cry? You know, many of us growing up were told that we shouldn't cry because it was not masculine, it was not manly, it was childlike. And if we want to grow up, if we want to be a man, then we shouldn't be experiencing those kinds of emotions. Note that women often get kind of the short end of the stick when they're told, hey, if you're assertive in work, right, then people are going to interpret that poorly. If I'm assertive at work as a man, people say, oh, look at that guy, he's a leader, he's a go-getter. If a woman demonstrates the same assertiveness in work and sticking to her guns, then she's often labeled, dare we say it, a bitch, right? So we live in these different realms of emotional experience because culture often has a hand that tells us what's appropriate or not. And different cultures operate differently in this regard. Many cultures, you know, emotional responding and talking about emotions and being very expressive emotionally is okay. Other cultures, you're really taught to suppress and emotions. The public display of emotion is inappropriate, and lots of spots in between. But think about the culture, the cultural context, right? The appraisal contributes to the cognition and the understanding of the emotion as a result of our cultural learning. And social interaction contributes to the social understanding of emotion. So this is, you know, a three-piece part of the puzzle. And just a simple example here that you see emotions considered negative and positive, right? And anger leads to all these different emotions, right? But what we see here is some differences, like in China, shame, right? Or sadness, but positive is sad love in the United States, right? Like bittersweet love, we love that term in the United States, that it has both components that might not be present in other cultures. So our cultural understanding of emotion, when we talk about cognitive processing of emotion, differs on the basis of culture. And notice, if we go back to Ekman, which has been a while since we talked about Ekman, but Ekman, how did he determine basic emotions? Because they were read as facial expressions. Probably a far more straightforward explanation, but maybe relatively simple in how it was created. So, and now I'm going to do a little advertisement, so excuse me. If you really want to dive deeply into this, no, we're talking about emotion for 2 modules in this course of motivation. I believe the ideas are quite inseparable, but at Ohio State we have 2 courses. We have psychology of motivation, we have psychology of emotion. So every semester psychology of emotion is offered, and I'd love it if you join me for that course, because we take a far broader view of emotion than we can in a course on motivation. So, okay. End of commercial. So, social and cultural aspects of emotion then, what do we know? Emotion knowledge, other people, right? And other cultures in general instruct us about the causes of our emotions. We have stories that we're taught since we're children about where emotions come from, right? The expression management, how we should express our emotions is that part there. And then finally emotion management, whether to control our emotions or let them loose. And notice I have this term display rules for these 2 boxes. Display rules are simply what is it acceptable to demonstrate as far as your emotional experience, what must you suppress, what is going to constitute a violation, what emotion is inappropriate in what context, and these are the display rules. Notice that one of the biggest dividers in display rules is gender, so male versus female emotions, and what's appropriate in different situations based on one's culture and one's own identity. That's about it for this one. I'm going to leave us with a goodbye from Cracker as she's checking out the fish tank. And pictures of Cracker always make me sad. It was hard. Cracker died on December 21st here at home. And she was kind of my familiar. She was kind of my best buddy. So, you know, you have mixed emotions about that because you want to reflect on all the good times you had, but the loss makes you very sad. Emotion is a complex thing, and I was somewhat not clear on my on what I should do because, you know, the Cracker is the picture on my phone, So if you look at my home screen for my phone, you know, there is Cracker right there in all her glory. And when she passed away, I look at this and it makes me sad. But I said, so should I remove these pictures? Should I, you know? And you know, that's a tough choice, and that's a choice often we have to follow with loss. Do we continue to, you know, maintain stimulus objects in our environment that cause us to experience these emotions, or do we not? Do we kind of set them aside, maybe because it's maybe too painful or whatever? And you can see how emotion affects motivation, because on the one hand, the sadness in seeing this picture and reminding myself of the sadness would motivate me to want to take these pictures down. But on the other hand, the behavior of taking these pictures down would then also maybe confront me with a certain level of weakness in being able to deal with my own emotions, which is okay in certain contexts and for certain people. I'm not saying don't not do that. This is not prescriptive or prescriptive, and we know the difference between those words. But in essence, it kind of captures the interface between emotion and motivation and subsequent behavior. And I will close on this. I'm a big fan of thinking in terms of emotion as emotions are for doing. And emotions cause action, they cause behavior. They have that tremendous motivational quality of either approaching, avoiding, or freezing. Anyway, I think that's good for this one, and I hope you guys are safe, and I hope you're well, and let's call it good.